Morning, guys. Hope everyone's doing good. Personally, I'm super excited to have Jonty on. Just give you a little background of where he's been and where he's come from and how his relationship with Rush is. But don't know if you've done any research, if you know who he was, but pretty much one of the fastest swimmers in the world in his heyday, let's say. So at college, he was, I believe I'm getting these right, was the 100-meter freestyle national champion. And then, unfortunately, due to the apartheid, didn't get to go to the Olympics in Montreal. But like right after the Olympics, ended up being the 100-meter world record holder and the 50-meter world record holder. So bottom line was during 1976 was the fastest swimmer in the world, which is pretty cool. And then went off after he's finished his swimming, competing. Probably the biggest challenge was working with us here at Pikes Peak. Sydney, his youngest daughter, played for me for a good couple of years, and then Cleone was his other daughter, and Jonty coached her. And I believe, Jonty, she went on to play rugby in college, yeah, Cleone? And she was
rugby in college, yeah.
Rugby in college. So she was a lesser player on the soccer field, but Jonty still coached them like they were champions. And then went off to coaching for the US Olympic team. And a young man that you might know, Michael Phelps, was part of the team that was Jonty was coaching, who I believe got about 8 gold medals in Beijing alone. And then, exciting for me, for the London Olympics, he went over to the dark side and helped coach the British swim team as well. Yeah, I've known him a long time from here in Colorado Springs. It's been awesome. It was a nerve-wracking some way to coach with him, but awesome to get lots of information and bleed him dry. So after about 5 years, we called him back and said, hey, can you help you guys out as well? So Jonty, thanks so much. Pleasure to speak with you again, and can take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I'll just add a couple of things to what Nick said. I actually spent from about 2002, I became very interested in the way the brain manages movement and the way the brain manages everything we do. I began an in-depth reading, kind of research on my own to understand this paradigm, because as a swimming coach, I don't know that you as soccer coach, but as a swimming coach, in my position now, I'm a college coach, but before I was a national team coach, and I'd be traveling around to different training centers and interacting with athletes and trying to fix problems, fix technical skill-based problems, and found it was very hard to do, especially when they became entrenched and they'd done the movement millions of times before. So in doing a lot of research on the neural side of things, I became much better at understanding what it took to change patterns of movement. And, it's one of those things that I think is very important. If you understand how the brain manages movement, how the brain manages everything we do, then it's a lot easier to create environments for your developmental kids, because then you lay the foundation the right way. And then if you have older kids like I do in college, and I have to kind of tear down take an athlete and completely tear down their stroke and build it from the scratch and bring it up the other side to develop a performance level that is well beyond anything they arrive with. It's a long, enduring process, and it can take anywhere up to 2 years for the athlete to get to the point where they actually swim faster than they did when they arrived, which if you're a female that's a high maintenance female, it's very hard to deal with that time period. And I'm talking about myself having to deal with the athlete, but just kidding. But it's something. So a lot of the presentation here is about brain stuff. What Nick failed to mention is that I played soccer all the way till I was in my late 50s, which that's a relative term, playing soccer, but you probably look at me and say, well, he was just kicking the ball around. Other people might say I was playing soccer, but if you can roll through the slides here, I'll just, kind of pull them up in the screen. So we all know that you play the game in your subconscious mind. If you're thinking on the field of play, if your athletes are thinking on the field of play, then if they're trying to think their way through what they're going to do, they're in trouble. They're going to be playing a slower level game than anything that, you want to see them play. So if you can roll through the next slide. The idea is that soccer is a quantum sport. Swimming is a linear sport. You go from this side to that side to this side to that side. It's simple. It's stroke rate, stroke counts, number of strokes, all those things. It's a very simple thing. whereas soccer is a very quantum sport, and the idea is that the relationship of A to B to C to D is multilinear. You could be constantly moving, evolving at the same time. And getting kids to understand how to play the game in a quantum environment is something that takes a lot of work, I think, on your part as coaches. I know that we got different background affiliations, but I'm a Chelsea fan. I've always been a Chelsea fan since I was a little guy, and I've obviously watched them. I've really enjoyed the change that Conte's brought to the game, the difference in the style of attack that they're using, especially in this year with some of the players they have this year. And it's probably because I watch them a lot, you can see a lot of quantum thinking in terms of how they approach the attacking process, especially when the other team doesn't park the bus type of thing. But anyway, this is soccer, it's quantum thinking. So if we go to the next slide, and I'm just going to blow through these slides fairly quickly. The concept of plasticity, the concept of the brain can actually change and evolve, didn't really grow roots until the late last century. I mean, there were still people that felt like we were hardwired, we couldn't change anything. We are the way we are, all the way up into the 1990s. Prior to the Second World War, you were considered a heretic if you said the brain was plastic and could change. We're born with 100 billion neurons, create 100 trillion connections, and there's some very distinct periods of brain maturation that, as soccer coaches, you need to sort of be aware of. And there are pruning periods where we're given all these billions of neurons, and if we don't use them, we lose them. And sort of around age 2, whatever we haven't used at that point in time gets sort of pruned back. So we've got a huge capacity for language. And if we only hear one language growing up, then some of that capacity gets pruned back because we need space. I mean, it's a very refined amount of space, and we don't want to waste it with neurons that are not ever going to be used to develop all different levels of language. At age about 13, about that teenage year, it gets pruned back again. And then we kind of slipped into this area where the prefrontal cortex starts to begin the maturation process, which ends about age 25. So to be honest with you, in terms of really understanding tactical movement and tactical awareness, doesn't really come into fruition until they're teenagers. You can teach foundational stuff as a young, and I know everyone likes to teach the triangle concept when they're younger, but they can't really grasp it till they're in their teenage years. And to spend, in my mind, you've got so much time that you can spend with athletes on the field. And I think that's the thing that most coaches have to come to grips with. I've got an hour. What's the most important thing I can do in this hour? And if you're doing stuff that has no relevance to being able to be absorbed or utilized effectively, then you're just wasting their time and your time. So I just threw that up there. If we can go to the next slide. We all think of having 5 senses, and those senses are fairly set there, but in my mind there should be basically 7 senses that we should be aware of, the 5 that we know. But the sense of balance is a key sense, and everything in the world of movement is compromised through loss of balance. And if you're dealing with players that are moving on a surface that is, in some cases, an uneven surface, and not everyone plays on the kind of fields they play in the Premier League. And I always love it when they go play some 3rd division team in the FA Cup and it looks like a cow patty, and I wonder how those players deal with being on a cow patty. But, if you don't have a sense, if you don't understand how much the sense of balance impacts everything you do, then it's something that you really need to take a really strong look at. And then the sense of fear, and I put fear up there because we're all survival based. We process everything that we do through the survival brain. And there's a lot of stuff that gets compromised in the development of soccer players because of this concept of fear. And like I was talking to Saul before everyone came on, but you take a group of 10-year-olds and you're talking to them and you throw a ball in the air and they scatter like screaming banshees because they don't want the ball to land on their head. It's just the way we process, and it doesn't matter we're in the most modern period in time, we're still driven through the whole survival instinct. And in my sport, in the sport of swimming, where the concept of drowning is a very real thing, everything is compromised through that fear of drowning. So I deal with a lot of problems in my sport, overcoming that issue, that survival issue. Go to the next slide. So there are three basic cortices that are involved in movement that it's worth looking at with regard to movement. One is the one we know is the motor cortex, which is the pattern of the movement. So the actual process of running, the pattern of running. The sensory cortex is the feel of that pattern of movement. So the motor, the feel, and then obviously the last one is the visual cortex. And those three cortices, along with many areas in the brain, are very involved in movement. Our brain is wired for hands and feet. So the large majority of the neurons are wired or connected to hands and feet and lips. And as I tell swimmers when I teach them in camp, that clearly is about kissing. Obviously it's important, but there are more neurons connected to my thumb than there are that are connected to my upper arm. So all our balance, this just shows you it's all balance related issues, hands and feet. In the sport of swimming, because it's survival based and we're in water and we're dealing with this medium where we can drown, we want to try to manage everything we do in a sport of swimming with our hands and feet, which is the absolute opposite of what it should be doing. We really have to managing everything from our core, because once you teach an athlete how to balance in the water and how to balance in the water from their core and have all movements emanate from their core in the sport of swimming, then you can begin to learn how to swim fast. So I don't think necessarily soccer is any different, because you want to manage all your balance with your hands and feet. And when kids run, how weird and awkward sometimes they look, especially when they're younger. And, when I get back to the learning process in the later slides here, I feel like there are a lot of things that can be done in an early stage, in a very early age, that have nothing to do with a soccer ball. They have nothing to do with soccer whatsoever. They all have to do with just learning how to manage balance and how to use your appendages as part of that movement balance. So when you take the main thing here is that when you remove the visual cortex, the sensory and the motor cortices kind of meld together a lot better. There's a lot more. If I put an fMRI cap where I can look at the electrical activity in the brain, and I kind of look at how the brain is lighting up relative to whatever movement is happening. If I take the eyes and close them, then there's a clear, stronger relationship between the sensory and the motor. They're both situated in the brain, contiguous in the brain. They're set up the same way in the brain. And in my sport, I really have to teach the kids how to map the sensory onto the motor, because it makes them much better athletes. They have much better feel for what they're doing in the water. And I don't think it should be any different on the soccer field. I think in your development process as coaches, you have to have a conscious understanding of the relationship of those three cortices, how they work together, and how on a regular basis in the development process that you're doing a job where you're matching sensory to motor, because I think it's very helpful. Next slide. Mirror neurons were really only discovered in the 1980s. Some scientists they had some monkeys wired. They had all these kind of area of the brain kind of mapped, and they were looking at movement and stuff like that. And then the scientists had sort of taken a lunch break, and a kid had walked up to look at the monkeys and was licking an ice cream, looking at the monkeys. And then the scientists realized that the monkey's brain fired up without even moving. So he was looking at the kid licking the ice cream, and it began licking the ice cream itself without moving. So they realized the brain, through mirror neurons, really can actually perform movement or show the actions of performing movement without doing anything at all. Autistic kids that are Asperger's type kids, have less mirror neurons than normal people. When we watch movies and we get all fearful or scared or embarrassed, those are the mirror neurons that are firing up that make us a part of what the movie is all about. But the reason that I bring the slide in here is I feel like kids during the whole video review, video utilization of video in the development teaching process. Sometimes, you know, you can just close your eyes and see yourself doing things and see yourself executing things, and it can be just as effective as actually executing it in real time. So because of mirror neurons, because we have mirror neurons, you have to, coaches, sort of say, okay, how am I going to use this? How effective can it be used and stuff like that. Next slide. So the visual cortex dominates the input playing field with regard to how the brain takes the information. You know, it's really hard for me as a swimming coach, but if I'm teaching an athlete a completely new skill, I'll put them in front of a TV and I'll show them that skill over and over and over again. Just one, you know, basically maybe a 2-second long kind of sequence of just a repetitive movement, totally focused on that. If I want to do it even better than that, I get them into virtual reality environments, so I kind of get it in a 3D format, you know, directly into their brain, and they just see this repetitive movement. Then I put a pair of goggles on them that are completely blacked out, so they have absolutely no way to see where they're going or what they're doing. I take the lane lines out, I put them in a safe environment. I have a nice long stick with a tennis ball in it. I can tap them on the head if they're running into anything that's dangerous. It takes them actually a little while to actually kind of get over the fear of being in that environment. But when they do, I find that when I take the eyes out completely and I put them in an environment after they have seen a repetitive video of something specific, that they are it's much easier for them to repeat what they've seen on the screen than if I just try to do it just in open water, just hey, try to do this type of thing. So when I remove the visual cortex, I can actually improve the ability to learn new skills, develop, change older skills than I can when I have it involved type of thing. Just for me in my environment, I mean, I have those pair of goggles get a lot of use on Thursdays when I do a lot of adjustments. But in looking at this, to give you an example, I work with a system called Dartfish. I know Nick is familiar with Dartfish. For one season, I filmed all the games. My youngest kid, I filmed all her games. I can't remember who the coach was at the time. I think it was the guy with the chick magnet car now, and I can't, Brian, he was the coach at the time. And anyway, so there was about 14 games that I filmed, 15 players in the squad. At the end on Sunday, I just take that game that we watched that was on my video, and I carve out maybe about 20 scenes, you know, corners, free kicks, you know, passing movements, things that I thought the kids would be good to look at. I'd have them up online, kids could access them, and I had well over 5,000 video reviews by the end of that season. Kids wanting to look at themselves playing the game. So, you know, when you're dealing with visual cortex and you're dealing with movement, it's best to show them what you want them to do. With cell phones these days, every kid can have a cell phone in the soccer field. They can actually kind of dial into the exact thing that you want that's online. They can look at what you want to do. They can put the cell phone down. They can close their eyes. They can picture that movement rehearsal in their mind, and then they can go through the process of actually doing it. And then hopefully at that point in time, you know, they get, you know, reinforcement from you. That's exactly right. They've got to do it intrinsically in their own mind. That's exactly right. But the visual cortex is it's a huge weapon in the development of athletes. Next slide. So making changes, you know, if I took, they've taken monkeys and they've chopped the middle finger off of a monkey. So when you remove the middle finger, what happens is there are a whole bunch of neurons that are connected to that middle finger. And when you remove that middle finger, they go dark. There's no longer any electrical activity in there. So, you know, the brain is such a dear space, you know, the real estate in the brain is extremely dear. So those neurons eventually get conscripted to other areas of the brain, and they're always conscripted to areas that are contiguous. So after about a month, if you kind of looked at movement in the hand, you'd find that some of those neurons that originally were dark are now conscripted to the ring finger and the index finger. And after 3 to 4 months, all those neurons are now mapped completely to other areas. So they are now been co-opted to do other jobs. The reason I put that up there for you is because it takes that long to change someone. And it only takes that long if that's the only option they have. The worst thing about making changes, whether it's running skills or running style or how you manage skills with the ball and stuff like that, it takes that long only if there's an exclusive usage of a new tool or a new skill. If you're mixing between the new skill and the old school, it can take years. So that just gives you a timeline of making a change and what it looks like. Next screen. So in terms of the development of players in the hierarchy of what's most important, to me, before a kid even gets to ball skills, to me, athleticism, being acrobatics and balance, that area, that layer of development of a young athlete is more important and should precede dealing with a ball skill. There are a lot of good books to read, but one of the books that dealt with, written by Coyle, talked about this lady, this Russian coach. She's an older lady in a I wouldn't call it, a resort, but basically a tennis gym outside of Moscow. There was a pile of crap compared to some of the stuff that we see in our world in Florida, some of the academies down there. But she has produced some of the best tennis players in the world. And her foundation, they are doing a lot of balance work and movement work and working with rackets, ground strokes, working with everything without a tennis ball. For a couple of years, they don't even see a tennis ball. They're just working on the basic skills, the basic balance and stuff that it takes to eventually deal with a tennis ball. And to be honest with you, I think as soccer coaches and dealing with young players, I think we all want to put the ball in front of them, and we all want to make the ball the most important thing. But to me, there should be hours and hours and hours of development of young people dealing with the first line of what development is about before you bring a ball in to, create problems with that environment, because when you introduce the ball, it's harder to deal with. So to me, there's a foundation that is a hierarchy in development of athletes, from athleticism and balance to ball skills. And then you can add from there the strength of that physical balance and core strength before you even get to tactical awareness. And my last line would be aerobic conditioning. To me, to waste any time with younger players, any players under the age of 13, with anything that might constitute aerobic conditioning, is wasting opportunity to teach them as coaches. I think if you do things in your practices that fatigue them before you deal with skills or balance or athleticism or any of those things, is wasting opportunity. I think you basically have mild activations in terms of your routine for warm-up, which is one of the great things about soccer that I brought back to the sport of swimming, that whole activation routine that a lot of coaches do, because you're dealing with that type of sport. Is more than enough to get ready to do everything you do. But to me, that was my hierarchy as far as the development of a player. And that's just again, it's my opinion. I don't do this this is not my profession. This is just the way I see that profession from the outside. Next slide. So if I'm looking at basic skills, I'm going to go back to the Dynamo gym. A lot of that initial motor neuron review rehearsal was done without tools. And in your case, your tool is a soccer ball. A tool might be a tennis racket, it could be a golf club. But to me, the initial establishment of motor neuron patterns of movement are best done without tools. And I think they are enhanced, and I'm going to come back to that old visual, motor, and sensory. Those movements and skills are done without tools and the eyes closed. So you deal with this whole kind of management of balance and what you're doing with your limbs and your extremities. When the eyes are closed, like I said, it just maps the motor to the sensory a lot better, and your end result down the road is going to be way better. When you begin doing skills with tools, in this case, a soccer ball, So to give you an idea, let's take a move that young kids love to try to do. Let's say a Maradona. When you try to do a Maradona with a soccer ball, it's impossible. But if you start learning how to do a Maradona without a soccer ball, and you can do a Maradona with your eyes closed, you know, if you do that as the basics to develop a Maradona move with a soccer ball, not that I ever see a Maradona move. I've never seen one done in the Premier League, really, to be honest. But you know, if we do it with the tool and eventually the tool with your eyes closed, it's the stepping stone of that skill. So you might use a ball that is heavier. So the indoor ball that has a little heavier weight to it, that type of ball, maybe even a heavier ball, or maybe even doing it with a tennis ball, or put it into an environment where you take away some of the normality of a normal soccer ball and you make it heavier, or you kind of deal with the unbalanced environment of making it smaller. But to me, in terms of basic skills, a hierarchical process of developing basic skills, it's movement patterns with no tools, with eyes, just like it says in the sheet. Next slide. To me, athleticism, I mean, if I have a choice as a swimming coach to work with athletes, and I have a choice of taking 10 kids who all they've ever done in their life is swim, and you know I've got 10 10-year-olds in Group A, and they learned to swim at age 4. By 5, they were starting to do some basic stuff. By 7, they were competitive swimmers, and they've been competitive swimmers for 3 years. Or have Group B, which are 10 kids that are 10 years old that basically swam part-time, maybe 1 or 2 days a week. They played soccer, they did karate, they did other stuff. They were multi-sport athletes that had very little experience in the sport of swimming. I am absolutely taking Group B to take them forward every day, all day, no questions asked. Because to me, athleticism is an essential component of any athlete I work with. It's the first question when I'm recruiting athletes. It's the first or second question I ask them. What other sports have you played? And when I find athletes that have played sports that deal with balance, dynamic movement, that type of stuff, I'm more excited about them than an athlete that has been swimming all their life. I took a intensive training center in Loughborough, England, and we put them through a ballet class once a week, which was absolutely so funny to watch because you know, swimmers on land don't exactly look really flowing and, fluid. And when you put them in a ballet class, it gets even worse. But to be honest with you, by the end of probably about 10 to 12 weeks of that class, running pirouettes didn't look that crazy. And to me, the athleticism, the exposure of their brain to that athletic dynamic movement improved their ability to learn other things. So to me, as soccer players, as soccer coaches, you've got to try to introduce things that create athleticism. And I think especially in that early stage of athlete development, the concept of athleticism is important. Clearly, anything that you're doing should be done initially kind of eyes open, eventually eyes closed, increase the complexity of the movements. And here's an element that this begins the process of laying the foundation in my mind for the tactical process many years down the road. The tactical process really shouldn't really come in heavy until after their teenage years. But if you can start beginning to teach them to do basic movements, basic levels of athleticism, and be thinking about other things at the same time. The best thing I read, and I spoke to Nick about many years ago, was this guy that made them do, arithmetic while performing movements, the ability to do math while performing basic movements or basic athleticism. To me, eventually puts you in a position where, and I didn't understand this. When my youngest daughter graduated to the competitive ranks, and like any parent, I was super happy that she actually made the Nike level at that year, because that meant she was playing with the better kids and would play in the better leagues and stuff. I didn't realize it until I talked with Nick at some point in time, and he said, you know, a lot of these kids don't know enough about skills. Their skills aren't very good. I'm having to teach them skills. And I thought, great, thanks. I'm one of those coaches that didn't teach them any skills, type of thing. So to me, the more you can, as you're going through the skill development process, kind of create an environment where they're able to think of other things while they're developing these skills, it lays the foundation so that by the time they become 11, 12, 13, a lot of their skills should be rote. The brain should not have to think about them, and they should be rote. And the ability to lay the foundation for complex thought while doing rote movements creates that tactical awareness in my mind. The reason I put the last thing on the line there, perform movements in bare feet. I mean, we are absolutely, our brain is wired for bare feet. We evolved with bare feet. Anytime we put a shoe on, we actually disturb the environment. And I know it's unsafe sometimes to put people in bare feet on playing fields in America. But to be honest with you, if you're in a gym or somewhere else and you can take shoes off them, put them in bare feet, I think it helps. And the next slide. Strength and conditioning, to me, I'm a college coach. I'm a water-based college coach. Obviously, my athletes work in the water. But I have 8 sessions that are actually water-based sessions and 6 sessions that are land-based sessions. So I do a lot of athleticism. I do a lot of strength and core development, connective, proprioceptive training on land that supports what they're going to do in the water. I feel like soccer is no different. I mean, the ability to me, core stability and balance is way more important than aerobic conditioning at the developmental level. Core stability and balance is way more important than aerobic conditioning, even at the base athletic competition level. So to me, those are things that can be started at I don't see any reason why even your 4 and 5-year-olds, when they begin playing, learn how to understand what core strength is, to understand what a plank is, to understand how a plank impacts what they do when they kick a ball, those kinds of things, those initial years. So to me, those are all important things to develop as you go through. And obviously dealing with the progression, other people can talk to you about that. But to me, there's a hierarchy in terms of what's more important in the time that you have as coaches. And then post-match recovery tactics is essential. You know, in my sport of swimming, I keep telling the athletes, it's not necessarily what really makes you a great athlete is not so much what you do in training, it's what you do outside of training, which is really the recovery work that you do, the stuff that you do after your practice to kind of get your body recovered, regenerated, so you're ready for the next practice. So especially when these kids get older, they can really help themselves to do a better job in day-to-day practices or matches and stuff because they take the time to do post-match. They have really good post-match recovery tactics. Next slide. And then the tactical, to me, the development of the tactical mind to become quantum in thinking in a quantum way. To be honest, I don't. This is more me thinking how it would be done. I've never really taken a group of kids and run them through stuff like this, but the idea in terms of the tactical is just to kind of open up the brain to be able to do it in this type. I would see it in this kind of pattern. Basically, maybe see it in a game. It would develop it from the ground up. So the ability to be able to think laterally while performing rote movements, and then eventually developing that pattern, find ways to understand how the movement pattern. I remember the very first time a competitive coach, and I was just a developmental coach, and I don't know if it was Nick at the time, said, all right, everyone has to get together one day. And then we put them in a big group over at Black Forest up in there, Fox Run Park. And they had them all running this crazy hell-pell kind of cross zigzag pattern amongst each other. And I thought, here's a collision waiting to happen. This is going to be ugly. But the reality was that just that process of running and avoidance, just it's a simple pattern of process of running and avoidance was actually a good thing to do at the time. But to me, the tactical side really comes from what you lay in the foundation, creating ways of doing it when they're older, and then putting it into them in a situation where the tactical side is so robust that playing becomes a free-form creative kind of circumstance where they're not necessarily doing things, even though again, when I watch a team like Chelsea play, you can see some things that have obviously been practiced on the practice field. A lot of times the pass will come in, down the middle to a midfielder who will just kind of hit it off the side of his heel, and the screen moves and it's to the center forward, who one times it to someone else. This is something that's been played in practice and set up in practice. But the best play, when I looked at, when Barcelona in their heyday, I remember the game many years ago, when they had Xavi and Iniesta and Messi and all those guys, and they were really playing, they run, 1,000 passes, connected passes, versus Arsenal was a good team at that time, only 300 type thing, that type of play. But anyway, that's your game, not mine. So last slide. These are just a couple things that this is something I always put up in front of swimmers, because I think it's important. Is getting athletes to embrace ownership over what they're doing. And as coaches, I think you got to really kind of create environments where they actually take ownership. If you overcoach them and you put too much time into telling them everything they have to do and how they do it and what they need to do, you'll never really develop good soccer players. When I get my athletes ready for a competition, we raced Ohio State, a couple days ago, 4 days, less than a week ago. I didn't get involved in any one of my kids warming up. I never timed anyone during the warm up. I never told anyone anything. I never asked them to do anything. They're all on autopilot. They all know what they need to do. They all know how to need to do it. When they race, they don't actually come and ask me after the race how they did, because they know I'm going to review the video, and eventually, once I've done the complete for a video review, they're going to get a synopsis of everything they need to be working on over the next couple of weeks. So a lot of it is on autopilot, a lot of it's on their own, and they have to take ownership to do it on their own and make it important to them. But I think this can be something that can be done from a very early age, and ask your kids to embrace the concept exploration, to explore, to find new things. Obviously, precise training is critical. Coyle was very specific about that. Perfectionists. I would anytime you work with a group of kids, you better know who your perfectionists are, and it's worth it just to, especially when you're working with young girls, say, okay, who in this group are perfectionists? And you probably have 1 or 2 kids that raise their hand, and you'll know that there are probably 5 or 6 more that should. But dealing with perfectionists is real important, because managing them how you manage the perfectionists will determine whether they will or won't develop as athletes. Probably the worst example of a perfectionist I filmed one day, I can't remember who the coach was at the time, but this young girl was playing on the field. I think she was 12 at the time. A ball had been passed from the center out to the wing. She was a right midfielder. Her intention as the ball was rolling across the field was to kind of meet it and punch it back in towards the center forward, who was making a run down the middle. And she totally miskicked the ball, mainly because the turf at El Pomar sucks. And the ball skewed off her foot and went off to the right corner. Her reaction to that action of hers was to scream, "Oh my God," stomp a foot, put her head down, scream, "Oh my God," turn around and start walking in the opposite direction. And then happened after a step or two to look around and realize the ball had actually gone out to the right wing. And being a good little player, she realized, "Oh my God, I have to go support the right wing." So off she went to support the right wing. Well, the irony of it is her mom and dad were both psychologists, and she was the worst case of a perfectionist I've ever seen in real life. But understanding them, managing them, helping them understand who they are and what they're about and how to be effective is real important. Understanding the role of reward. To me, there are so many things that you can do with athletes on a soccer field, but if they do not understand the role of the reward, your ability to teach them as coaches and help them develop as young players will be retarded to some degree. So intrinsic reward is a really important component. The athletes, the athlete themselves has to say in their own mind, "Hey, I did a great job. Well done. Well done." And not only say well done, but feel that nice little vibration go down their spine into their gut that says, "Yeah, well done." So when I coach competitive soccer at that level, kids are out in the field of play. You've got flowing play, what's going on out there. Eventually, I taught my kids to understand that if I yelled their name in the middle of something, they realized after a while, when I yelled their name, I wasn't asking for play to stop. I wasn't doing something to stop someone from playing. I was just letting them know that I'd recognized they'd executed something really well prior to that point, and that they knew that whatever they had done, they had to go into their head and say, hey, well done. Yeah. I did a give and go. This was my first one, and get excited and happy about it. So really impress upon kids to understand what the role of reward is. The process is recognize doing something well, and then more important than that, to reward yourself for doing something well. I read a great book that talked about the 4 R's. I don't know if you're familiar with the 4 R's, but they're important. Is especially if you're trying to fix something and get something to be better or new or change a behavior. One is recognize the behavior. Another is redirect the behavior. So do something better. Relabel the behavior. So, something bad to something good. And then the 4th R is reward, understanding the role of reward. And to me, those are just the last things I'll put in front of you. I'll just entertain questions if anyone has questions. But to me, those are two really important things. Last thing here, I know Nick has read this book. I would recommend this book to all coaches because I think it's something that these are books that are easy to read and they open your mind. But then the number one is the top one is The Brain That Changes Itself by a guy named Deutsch. The Talent Code by Coyle is okay. It tells you a lot about myelin and how to develop patterns of movement. Biology Belief is okay. The Sports Gene right now is probably another one that's worth reading. And then anytime you get something from a guy that's name is Ramachandran in terms of brain is really good. But I'll do the Deutsch thing and maybe the Sports Gene right now, probably 2 good books if you haven't read them, worth reading. And so that's it.
Hey, Jonty, thank you very much. That was awesome. I know that Nick has a question here, and I have a couple, so we'll get going. And then if anyone else on the call has any questions, feel free to unmute and hop in.
Okay.
Hey, Jonty, one thing I got written down is about the visualization. Do you do any training with them beforehand to sort of train them to understand how to do visualization before, throwing them in a soccer situation with their eyes closed?
Yes. I mean, to me, it's something that I can't tell you how I would do it from a very, very early age. I think everyone can figure that out. But how to visualize, how to picture, see things in your mind, it's not hard to do. I mean, we're wired for it. We're already there. So to answer your question, I mean, in terms of visualization, when I work with the college athletes, with the athletes at this level, I teach them about how to understand how to meditate. So we go through training sessions on how to meditate, how to get yourself into a meditative environment, what it entails. And then once they understand, once they reach a meditative state, and I don't know that kids prior to teenage years can really actually do this effectively, then they can then go through the process of picturing things in their head, actually seeing themselves executing or performing or achieving goals and stuff like that. To me, you can't just do it willy-nilly, but you can do it in a meditative state. But to be honest with you, I ask kids on the wall all the time, and I always ask my kids on the wall before they do something new, just to close their eyes just for that second and see themselves doing something. Not, at worst, I can show them something on a video screen and say, look at this, close your eyes, see yourself doing this, go type thing. But that's sort of the different levels that I use it.
So then this is go back to my college days, and I actually don't even remember the answer, but seeing it as if you're seeing it through your own eyes, or seeing it as if you are on TV, like seeing yourself doing it, or seeing it through your own eyes? Own
eyes. It has to be, because then it's a 3D environment. This might be not germane to soccer, but I'm going to take the sport of football. You take quarterback play in the sport of football. They spend a lot of time just looking at video. They just look at video, and then it gives them some information. But if you took a quarterback and you put him into virtual reality goggles, you put them on their head, and you put accelerometers on their arms, and you had them throw a football at a backdrop, just like if anyone in here is a golfer and you've gone into a golf store and you tried out a new club and you get in there and you hit a ball off a little tee, and all of a sudden you've got all this video that tells you hooked at 55 yards to the left at blah, 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 and they give you all that information, right? That's all accelerometers. So you could take a quarterback in virtual reality throwing a football that could be high school speed, college speed, pro speed, dealing with patterns of movement. So to me, the more you can put it into a 3D in your brain environment, the more enhanced it's going to be.
Thanks.
Makes sense. Just one quick question from me. I noticed that you said when you were talking about activation, warm-up and things like that, that you took an activation from soccer session and you brought it into swimming. And I know that a lot of us coaches that go through courses and things like that, we're basically told, hey, you are supposed to do an activation warm-up and things like that. What's your theory behind it? Because I'm not sure that, I've certainly it's never been explained on a formal coaching course. I have some thoughts and some theories and some research behind it. What's your thought behind why did you bring it from soccer to swimming?
Well, to me, just to open up the joints, right?
Okay.
To get a little bit of blood flow, get a little core temperature, basically just to open up, wake up the neurons, open up the blood flow, open up the joints, all those things, just put yourself in a position where you're ready to do something. I mean, I take it even further than that. I mean, a lot of, you'd think for swimming, swimmers would normally dive in a pool and they do some light activation on land, dive in the pool, warm up in the pool, and then get it ready to race. A lot of the sprinters that I work with today actually will go through an intense dry land routine with med balls and pull-ups and push-ups and jumps to where they're physically sweating. And then they get in the pool and they do like 400 in the pool. So they'll go activation, intensive dry land routine, swim about 400 in the pool, climb out, dry off, and then they're ready to race, which is the antithesis of the way people normally warm up for swimming. So to me, it's just the stepping stone process of opening everything up and getting ready to do. So like some of my sessions are precursor is yoga. So they'll go 15 minutes of yoga and might go through 10, patterns that open up the hips and shoulders, and then into a land routine and in the water, or just a simple activation process that just opens up the joints and just basically gets a little level excitement level. It can be enough to where it just increases the core temperature a little, and that's all it really is.
Okay, it's awesome. And then the other question I had, and this is kind of around the current climate of learning and theories and thought processes with the US not qualifying for the World Cup. There are so many questions about coaching in the United States and how we as youth coaches go about things. And there are constant debates on the theories that come out of Barcelona, La Masa, and the constant pressure and repetition under pressure versus the process that is probably more commonly applied, where there's a skill development in young ages over a player and a ball, and things like that. And from what I can take away from your presentation, it's certainly blended. But in the younger ages where you're talking about movement and balance and things like that, it's and I don't know if isolated movement is the right term. It seems that your theories and opinions and research and things suggest that may be a way to lend itself to better skill development. Does that make sense?
It does. If you learn how to do, if you do all these, I'm just going to go back to the Dynamo Club. If you manage all the ground strokes and the skills and the movement and everything without the complications of a tennis ball, Just like you can learn all the athleticism and balance and dynamic of movement in soccer on a field without the complications of a soccer ball, then you will create if I take 3 athletes, one starts with a soccer, one starts without a soccer ball, either or. I guarantee the kid that starts without a soccer ball will, in time, with all things being equal, develop a much better potential down the road than the kid that starts with the ball, because they will learn the balance and the movement, the framework and the foundation, the brain's understanding of how to manage all those environments, so that when the soccer ball is actually introduced, their strength of movement down the road will be enhanced, because they start with a much better foundation, as opposed to one that is constantly compromised through loss of balance. I mean, when I put the slide up that included balance in it, it's a critical element. In the sport of swimming, it's everything. Every problem I deal with in the sport of swimming comes from the loss of balance. And the loss of balance in the sport of swimming is come from the fact that drowning is a very, very, something that kids fear constantly. So they compromise all their movement because they're looking at where they're going. They pick their head completely out of the water to take a breath to make sure they don't breathe any water itself. So it's all compromised. So, and I don't know if everyone on this call knows that, but the brain, it doesn't matter whether an athlete's on land or an athlete's in the water. When you lose balance, the brain reacts the same way. So if you run across the field and you trip, the first thing you're going to do, you put your hands out, and you don't say, oh my God, I got to put my hands out. Your brain just says, get the hands out, because that lessens the impact of the fall. But the other thing the brain does that no one really knows is that your ankle goes into a closed joint position, which means a closed joint means you're going to pull your toe up towards your shin. So your chances of catching your feet and getting yourself feet underneath you are much greater. And the brain does that automatically for you. You don't have to think about it. Well, in the sport of swimming, when we lose balance, when an athlete loses balance in the water, the same thing happens. The hands actually physically go out like you're going to fall on ground, and the ankle goes into a closed joint position. So when I watch an athlete underwater, if someone says, hey, can you watch my swimmer? And they swim across the screen and I'm watching them underwater in freestyle, or even if I'm standing on deck and watch them swim by me, the only thing I watch on the first pass is what's going on with their legs. Because if their feet are constantly going into a closed joint position, I know there's complete loss of balance in what they're doing. Even though it might look, that was the thing that amazed me about some of the British swimmers, is that they look technically really well. They look nice, they look pretty. But when you looked at them, there was no balance whatsoever at all, because they were just constantly kicking in ways that created more drag than propelling themselves through the water. So to come back to what you said, to me, that balance issue and learning how to do all these skills and have great athleticism balance will lend to creating much better soccer players, so that when they put them in this cauldron of under fire, they're more prepared and ready to do what you want them to do than not having gone through that initial process.
No, for sure. And that fits in, a conversation that Nick and I have on a fairly regular basis is we watch young players play, and we're like, it just looks, it's not rhythmic. It doesn't look like an athlete moving. And it looks awkward and rigid, and that would lend itself to the idea that they're not getting the right things at the younger stages to develop the balance and the movement.
Right. I think the best thing I did with my youngest kid, and I'm not sure why I did it at the time, but I put her into a track and field camp one summer. And there was no question in my mind that the track and field process of developing running skills and running balance and all the skills that went along with running was a huge amount of stuff that, I mean, if I was smart, I would have put her in that camp for maybe 2 or 3 years in a row. And I think she'd really have developed that fluidity that you're talking about.
Yep.
But I mean, soccer coaches don't think to put their kids in track and field camps to improve running skills, and neither would swimming coaches, because, I go back to that A or B, that group of 10 kids, A or B, I'm taking B any day of the week.
Okay.
Someone asked me what the 4 R's were again, Chris. Is that a question? So you recognize a bad pattern. You redirect a bad pattern. So you say, I don't want to do this, I want to do that. And then not only do you do that, but you relabel that new pattern and give it a very strong positive name. And then the fourth is reward yourself for executing the pattern. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thanks, Jonty. Could you also do that with, instead of behaviors you don't want, but behaviors you want? So if you...
Exactly the same. Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, if you look at behaviors, you look at the field of psychology, they deal with behaviors. Behaviors would take a kid with an OCD issue, and if they wash their hands every time they touch a doorknob, you know, the behaviors want to say, okay, we're going to make you touch 10,000 freaking doorknobs, and we're not going to let you wash your hands. Well, this research at UCLA realized this wasn't a cognitive psychology issue. It was actually a process with the wiring in the brain that caused the problem. And when he taught people how to rewire the brain, it solved the problem. So the process of recognition, redirection, relabel, reward was his process that came. That's the main thing that came out of the book that I read.
Thank you. Just a second follow-up to that, the feedback. So when we're giving players feedback, do you feel that it is more important to give the positive, honest feedback as opposed to the constant negative barrage that may go out? You know, if you go out onto the soccer fields and you're at a tournament, generally a lot of the feedback given is not positive. What are your thoughts on that, Jonty?
It just you don't see me here, but I'm chuckling and laughing. But it doesn't matter what athlete you're dealing with. It doesn't matter whether I'm dealing with a swimmer or dealing with a soccer player. No one reacts very well to negative feedback, especially personalities that can't handle it. I mean, especially personalities that can't handle it. So to me, I never start, if I'm going to pick on someone, you know, number one, I need to know whether I can do that in public or I can't. There are some kids you can say, you know, kind of deal with them and deal with their issues in public. And there's some that you never deal with them in public. And sometimes I have big, strong, beefy, brawny, kick your ass kind of guys, and I still don't do it in public. All right. So know your athletes and know your players into where you want to deal with them, what environment you want to deal with them in. But I never start something out on the negative because they're never going to hear you. You know, I'd say 25% of the players that you deal with can deal with constant barrage of negative input. Fix this, fix that, fix this, do this better, do that better, without anything positive, and be able to deal with it. You know, there may be a quarter of the players you deal with can deal with that. The rest of them, you know, you got to say, man, you're getting better, but this is what you can do to get better than that. Amazing the different results you'll get from that simple statement as to, you need to do this to get better. I mean, that's a catch-all thing. You want to be more specific about it, but, you know, players, athletes, swimmers constantly want to improve. They're constantly finding ways to improve. The example I gave you of how many video reviews those kids used at the end of that year showed that they wanted to find ways to get better. So, you know, it's an important element, obviously, in coaching is to help kids. It's just like my youngest kid plays, you know, in college, and it doesn't change when you get to college. She wants to know, you know, what she's doing wrong, how she can do something, what she's going to do to get it better, some skills that she can use to help get it better, that type of stuff. So, you know, to me, you always got to be real careful about who you, to me, the main answer to your question is know who you're dealing with, because some kids can handle it and some can't. And you've got to know the difference between the two. And it's always better by default to say something good before you say something bad.
Thanks, Jonty. I'll be trying to get a hold of you through Nick for developmental webinars based on your availability. But thank you very much. Great answers, and thank you for doing this.
No, my pleasure. I just enjoyed it.
Hey, Jonty, Seth here. I have a question for you.
I'm good.
Okay.
Seth, if you could.
Are there any major differences in brain development between the male and female brain in regards to like the younger ages?
No, all the way up to age 13, really no. But the female brain tends to mature faster than the male brain. When we go through this period where we start developing the prefrontal cortex, up to that point in time, again, this is just an area that is saturated in neurons that really haven't formed a lot of connections at that point in time. But we go through this whole period of the social development of the athlete. The females tend to mature earlier socially than the men. So there are differences in that respect in the age of maturation when dealing with the prefrontal cortex. I mean, some girls think that men don't really get to maturation till age 45, but there is that difference there, yes.
Hey, Jonty, how are you doing? This is Colin here. Quick question for you. You mentioned earlier on the importance of the brain when you're working on physical literacy and developing physical literacy with younger players. How is there a point where it gets harder to develop the physical literacy? Does the level of kind of elasticity slow down at any point? Like, if you take a 3-year-old, you can teach them to balance, you can teach them and they can absorb the information. At what point does it start to become more difficult to absorb that?
You mean at what age? No, I don't, I take college kids and I have to teach them what you should teach 4- and 5-year-olds sometimes. And granted, because they've been encumbered by so many different patterns of movement and exposures that it actually takes them longer than it takes a 4-year-old to do it. I still find that I'm able to do it, to a degree. I mean, sometimes not perfectly, but to a degree. But, I don't know that there is a point in terms of what you're talking about.
Okay, so it's taking longer because they're having to break down old habits and then rebuild from scratch, as opposed to learning it as an initial kind of thing. Correct.
I mean, in the sport of swimming, sometimes millions of cycles, and to go again, just real quickly, I mean, the way the brain absorbs information, we think of the left and right hemisphere as managing. The left hemisphere manages the right side and the right hemisphere manages the left side. But the reality is that the right hemisphere is the seat of exploration, metaphor, music, stuff that we don't know. The left hemisphere is the seat of everything that we do know. So when we learn something new, we're in our right hemisphere. And once the brain establishes enough patterns of movement to where it says, okay, I know exactly what the hell you're doing, and I've got this, it takes that pattern of movement and puts it into automated process on the left side. And the reason it does that is because it wants to automate as much as possible in its life so that it has all this other awareness ready for threats. So when I deal with and if I'm teaching an athlete a new turn in the pool, and the turn they show me is completely shite, so I teach them, so I take them away from the wall, I put them in the middle of the pool, and I teach them how to execute a completely new turn. And they can do it very, very well because it's a new thing. It's not against the wall. It's not dealing with the wall. And I'm like, great, you've got this really good. And I say, okay, let's swim to the wall and do that. Well, the problem is when they swim to the wall, the brain, if they're not focusing or concentrating, which happens even at the elite level in college, the brain says, nah, I know what you're going to do. You're going to do this. And it just produces what they know. So it produces everything that's in the left side because it's been done millions of times, as opposed to something new that you've done just that time in that instance in itself. And that's just another thing with the brain you have to overcome.
Okay, thanks. So then that kind of ties into, you mentioned the book, The Talent Code, before, and it gets brought up a lot when you're talking about player development, the whole kind of 10,000 hours of purposeful practice and stuff Correct. Like that. Yeah. It's basically a case of the more you do something, the better you get at it, for want of possibly getting any more simple. It's, if you start it at a real young age, and as long as you're learning the right things, then you'll be okay. But if you have to revisit it later and break it back down and retrain it, then it's a harder process.
Well, when I have a group of kids, and in camp I might have anywhere from a 10-year-old to a 17-year-old. I usually say the 10-year-old takes a couple weeks, the 14-year-old takes a couple months, and the 17-year-old takes a couple years.
Fair enough.
I mean, it's hard. I mean, I've constantly, I have a freshman that, he wasn't even on the charts. They do, I don't know if soccer, in the world of soccer, you have 3 or 4 5-star recruits, but he wasn't even a 2-star recruit. And he had some real flaws. And it took me a year to teach him how to solve his flaws. And then it took him another kind of half a year to develop some strength in this whole new pattern of movement. And then by the end of his second year, he all of a sudden took this explosion forward with regard to managing this whole new pattern of movement. And this year, he's at a point now where he's ranked #1 in the country in his event. And it's just a process of, retraining, rebuilding, reestablish both the fitness and the strength and the power to manage everything you do. But it's doable. It just takes time.
Cool, thank you.
Jonty, I wanted to be sensitive to your time. I know we asked you to go from 10 to 11 and we're a couple of minutes over. So
No problem.
I really appreciate you coming on. I think it's been an awesome presentation. I know I've taken a lot away. And so yeah, thank you very much. And hopefully your season continues to go well. And yeah, we'll,
all right, no problem. I enjoyed it. It was fun.